Victoria Hayes was certain the woman sitting beside her did not belong in first class. She reached that conclusion within 3 seconds of looking up from her tablet, and it was the same conclusion several nearby passengers quietly reached as well. The woman wore a simple navy coat, carried an ordinary shoulder bag, and looked completely out of place among the designer luggage, luxury watches, and tailored suits filling the front cabin. What nobody realized was that before the aircraft ever left the gate, a single update inside the airline system would change the way every person on board looked at her. Evelyn Brooks settled into seat 2A and placed her bag beneath the seat in front of her. She moved with calm confidence, neither impressed nor intimidated by the luxury around her. Across the aisle, Victoria watched with growing irritation. Finally, she leaned toward another passenger and spoke just loudly enough to be overheard. "There has to be some mistake." Several people glanced toward Evelyn. The comment spread through the cabin without needing to be repeated. A businessman lowered his newspaper. Another passenger looked at Evelyn's clothing and then at her seat assignment. The judgment was immediate. Evelyn appeared to notice none of it. She simply opened a book and began reading. That seemed to bother Victoria even more. Most people, when confronted with social pressure, showed signs of discomfort. Evelyn showed none. A flight attendant approached carrying a tray of welcome beverages. Victoria smiled politely and then nodded toward Evelyn. "Would you mind double-checking the seating assignments?" she asked. The flight attendant blinked. "Is there a problem?" Victoria lowered her voice slightly, but not enough. "I just want to make sure everyone is seated correctly." The implication landed exactly as intended. Several passengers exchanged looks. The flight attendant glanced at Evelyn's boarding pass resting partially visible on the armrest. Everything appeared normal. "She is in the correct seat," the attendant said professionally. Victoria smiled, but it was the kind of smile that challenged rather than accepted. "Interesting." A hush lingered for a moment. Evelyn slowly closed her book. "Is something wrong?" she asked calmly. "Not at all," Victoria replied. "I just thought first class was fully booked." A few passengers smiled awkwardly. Others pretended not to listen while listening carefully. The tension inside the cabin continued to build. Yet Evelyn remained remarkably composed. Instead of defending herself, she looked toward the flight attendant and asked a question. "Has the priority manifest synchronized with operations yet?" The attendant froze for a fraction of a second. It was subtle, but Victoria noticed it immediately. So did 2 nearby passengers. "I am sorry," the attendant asked. "The priority manifest," Evelyn repeated. "Sometimes updates take a little longer before departure." The attendant looked confused. Most passengers had never heard those words before. Victoria gave a short laugh. "You sound very familiar with airline procedures." Evelyn returned her attention to the book in her lap. "More than most people assume." The answer created another shift in the cabin. The flight attendant studied her for a moment before walking away. Victoria folded her arms. The woman beside her seemed far too calm for someone being quietly questioned by an entire first-class cabin. And somewhere beyond the boarding door, a notification was already moving through the airline's system toward the aircraft, carrying information that would soon make every assumption in the cabin look very different. The flight attendant continued down the aisle, but her expression had changed. She remained professional, yet Evelyn's question lingered in her mind. Most passengers never mentioned operational manifests. Most frequent travelers did not either. It was the kind of phrase usually heard from airline personnel or people with unusual access to internal procedures. Back in seat 2A, Evelyn reopened her book as though nothing significant had happened. Across the aisle, Victoria watched her closely. The calmness felt almost deliberate now. Not arrogant, not defensive, just completely unaffected by the judgment surrounding her. That bothered Victoria more than she wanted to admit. A businessman seated nearby leaned toward Victoria. "Maybe she travels often," he suggested quietly. Victoria glanced toward Evelyn. "Maybe," she replied. "Or maybe she knows how to sound important." The comment earned a few restrained smiles from nearby passengers. Social pressure was beginning to work in her favor. People naturally trusted confidence. And Victoria projected confidence effortlessly. Evelyn, meanwhile, appeared ordinary. In most social settings, that alone was enough to influence perception. A few rows away, another passenger looked toward the front of the cabin and whispered something to his companion. Soon several sets of eyes were drifting toward Evelyn whenever she was not looking. The atmosphere felt increasingly uncomfortable, yet the woman at the center of it seemed untouched by the tension. Moments later, the same flight attendant returned with pre-departure beverages. She paused beside Evelyn's seat. "Would you care for something to drink?" she asked. Evelyn smiled politely. "Sparkling water would be perfect." "Thank you." The attendant handed her the glass. Then she hesitated. "May I ask something?" Evelyn looked up. "Of course. How did you know about manifest synchronization?" The question immediately attracted attention. Victoria lowered her tablet. Two nearby passengers stopped pretending not to listen. Evelyn considered the question for a moment. "Experience," she said simply. The answer only deepened the mystery. "Experience doing what?" Victoria asked before the attendant could respond. Evelyn looked toward her. "Flying." Victoria gave a short laugh. "That is not exactly a detailed answer." Several passengers smiled. The tension sharpened. For the first time, the interaction felt less like curiosity and more like a public challenge. Yet Evelyn remained composed. "Not every answer needs to be detailed," she replied. The flight attendant glanced between them before excusing herself and continuing down the aisle. Victoria folded her arms. The conversation should have embarrassed Evelyn. Instead, it somehow left Victoria feeling frustrated. Every attempt to place the woman into a category seemed to fail. A notification suddenly appeared on a tablet carried by a crew member. Near the galley, the crew member frowned briefly and tapped the screen. Another notification followed almost immediately. He exchanged a look with a colleague. Neither passenger noticed. Yet something behind the scenes had begun changing. Back in first class, Victoria decided to push further. "You travel for business?" she asked. Evelyn turned a page in her book. "Sometimes." "What kind of business?" Another pause. "The kind that keeps me busy." A few passengers chuckled. Victoria did not. The answers felt frustratingly incomplete. But beneath her irritation, something else had begun to appear. Doubt. Because the woman she had dismissed at first glance was not reacting the way most people would. And somewhere inside the airline system, a record attached to Evelyn Brooks was moving through final verification. The aircraft door remained open as final passengers boarded, but the atmosphere inside first class had already settled into an uncomfortable rhythm. Every few minutes, someone glanced toward Evelyn Brooks. Every few minutes, Victoria Hayes noticed and felt quietly validated. The social verdict seemed almost unanimous. Evelyn did not fit the image people expected to see in the front cabin. Yet the woman herself appeared completely unaware of the scrutiny. Or perhaps she simply did not care. She continued reading while conversations quietly formed around her. Across the aisle, Victoria checked messages on her phone and occasionally looked up. The more she observed Evelyn, the more determined she became to prove her instincts right. Confidence had carried Victoria through most of her professional life. She trusted her ability to read people. And everything about Evelyn suggested someone who had somehow ended up in a place beyond her usual circumstances. Near the front galley, two crew members were speaking in unusually low voices while reviewing information on a tablet. One of them glanced briefly toward seat 2A before looking back at the screen. The interaction lasted only seconds, but the flight attendant who had served Evelyn earlier noticed it immediately. A small crease formed on her forehead. Something unusual was happening. Back in the cabin, a middle-aged passenger seated nearby finally joined the conversation. "Do you fly often?" he asked Evelyn. She looked up from her book and smiled politely. "Quite a bit." "Business or leisure?" "A little of both." The answer was pleasant but gave away nothing. Victoria shook her head slightly. "You really do have a talent for answering questions without answering them." A few passengers smiled. The remarks sounded playful, but the challenge underneath it was obvious. Evelyn closed her book gently. "Sometimes people ask questions because they want information," she said. "And sometimes they ask because they already think they know the answer." The comment landed harder than anyone expected. Several nearby passengers looked away. Victoria forced a smile. "And which do you think this is?" Evelyn held her gaze for a moment. "I think you are intelligent enough to decide that for yourself." The response was calm, respectful, yet somehow it left Victoria with no clear way to continue the confrontation. For the first time, she felt slightly off balance. Then another shift occurred. A flight attendant approached from the galley and quietly spoke to the lead attendant. Both women glanced toward Evelyn before immediately lowering their voices. The exchange lasted only a few seconds, but passengers noticed. Curiosity spread. Victoria noticed it too. Her attention sharpened. Something had clearly changed behind the scenes. The lead attendant walked away carrying a tablet. Her expression was no longer neutral. It carried a trace of concern mixed with surprise. Moments later, she disappeared through a curtain leading toward the operations area. The businessman seated nearby leaned forward. "Do you think something is wrong?" Victoria shrugged. "Probably just paperwork." Yet even she sounded less certain than before. Evelyn, meanwhile, seemed entirely unbothered. She looked out the window at the airport lights reflecting across the tarmac. The calmness was becoming impossible to ignore. Most people under that level of social scrutiny would have become defensive, uncomfortable, or eager to explain themselves. Evelyn did none of those things. And somewhere beyond the cabin, a senior operations notification had just reached a device belonging to Richard Lawson. Within minutes, a routine flight would become something nobody in first class would forget. The lead flight attendant returned several minutes later, but she no longer carried herself with the relaxed confidence she had shown during boarding. Her attention moved immediately towards seat 2A. The change was subtle, yet impossible to miss. Victoria noticed it first. Then the businessman nearby noticed it as well. Soon several passengers were quietly watching the crew instead of Evelyn. Something had shifted. Nobody knew what. The attendant paused beside Evelyn and offered a professional smile. "Ms. Brooks, is everything comfortable?" The question sounded ordinary, but the tone was different. Respectful. Careful. Evelyn looked up from the window. "Everything is fine, thank you." The attendant nodded and remained there for a second longer than necessary before walking away. Victoria frowned. Earlier, the crew had treated Evelyn like any other passenger. Now they seemed unusually attentive. The difference irritated her. She turned slightly in her seat. Interesting change in service. Evelyn glanced toward her. "Is it?" Victoria smiled politely. "You tell me." Before Evelyn could answer, another crew member appeared near the front cabin carrying a tablet. He exchanged a quiet conversation with the lead attendant. Both glanced toward seat 2A. Then both looked back at the screen. The businessman lowered his newspaper. "Now I am curious." A few nearby passengers laughed softly. Curiosity was spreading faster than judgment now. Yet Victoria refused to let go of her original conclusion. "There is probably some administrative issue," she said. "Airlines make mistakes all the time." The statement sounded reasonable. Even so, she was beginning to convince herself more than anyone else. Evelyn simply returned her attention to the airport outside. Aircraft lights moved slowly across the tarmac. Service vehicles crossed beneath the wing. She seemed completely detached from the social drama unfolding around her. That calmness continued attracting attention. Most people would have been eager to explain themselves by now. Evelyn never volunteered a single detail. A few moments later, the curtains separating the cabin from the forward operations area opened. A tall man in a dark suit stepped through. Several crew members immediately straightened. The reaction caught the attention of nearly everyone nearby. He was not a pilot. He was not ordinary cabin crew either. The authority surrounding him was obvious. He spoke briefly with the lead attendant while reviewing information displayed on a tablet. Then his eyes lifted toward first class. For the briefest moment, they stopped on Evelyn. Victoria felt a surge of confidence. Finally, she thought, someone important had arrived. If there was an issue with the seating assignment, it was about to be resolved. The man exchanged another quiet conversation with the crew. His expression changed slightly as he continued reading. Not concern, not confusion, something closer to surprise. The lead attendant looked equally stunned. Around the cabin, passengers sensed the shift immediately. Conversations faded. Curiosity intensified. The businessman folded his newspaper completely. Even passengers farther back were beginning to notice the unusual activity near the front rows. Victoria sat taller in her seat, convinced she was moments away from being proven right. Yet as the man in the suit started walking forward, he was not looking at the empty seats. He was not looking at boarding records. He was looking directly at Evelyn Brooks. And for the first time since boarding began, a faint smile appeared on his face. The man in the dark suit moved through the first-class cabin with quiet authority. Crew members stepped aside automatically as he approached. Victoria watched with growing anticipation. Every instinct told her the mystery was finally about to end. The businessman nearby folded his arms and leaned forward slightly. Several passengers stopped all conversation. Even those pretending not to pay attention had become fully invested. The man stopped beside Evelyn's seat. For a brief moment, nobody spoke. Then something happened that nobody expected. His smile widened. "Ms. Brooks," he said warmly. "I was hoping the update would reach us before departure." The cabin fell silent. Victoria blinked. That was not the tone of someone addressing a passenger with a problem. It sounded more like someone greeting an important guest. Evelyn looked up and returned the smile. "I assumed it would eventually catch up with the flight." A few passengers exchanged confused glances. The businessman frowned. The conversation sounded as though both of them already understood something nobody else did. The man nodded. There was a delay in the synchronization process. Operations finally pushed the corrected information through a few minutes ago. Evelyn closed her book. "That explains the attention." A quiet laugh escaped the man. "You noticed?" It would have been difficult not to. Several passengers shifted uncomfortably. Victoria felt her confidence slipping for the first time. The man glanced toward the lead attendant. "Thank you for your patience," he said to Evelyn. "We were not expecting the update so close to departure." The attendant nodded respectfully. Respectfully. Victoria noticed that detail immediately. Earlier, the crew had treated Evelyn as an ordinary traveler. Now the atmosphere around her felt entirely different. The man then introduced himself. "Richard Lawson, Senior Flight Operations Director." The title immediately caught the attention of several frequent travelers. One passenger actually sat up straighter. Richard continued reviewing information on his tablet. Then he looked back at Evelyn. "Everything appears correct now." Evelyn nodded. "Good." The simplicity of the exchange only deepened the mystery. Victoria could no longer contain herself. "Excuse me," she said. Richard turned politely toward her. "Yes." Victoria forced a smile. "Is there some kind of issue with the passenger records?" Richard glanced briefly at the screen before answering. There was an update. An update involving her? The question hung in the air. Several passengers watched closely. Richard's expression remained professional. "Yes." Victoria waited. So did everyone else. Richard studied the tablet for another moment. Then a look of genuine surprise crossed his face. Not because he had discovered a problem, because he had apparently noticed something else. His eyes moved from the screen back to Evelyn. "I have to admit," he said, "I did not realize this would be your first flight with the updated designation." Evelyn smiled faintly. "Neither did I." The businessman exchanged another confused look with the passengers nearby. Updated designation. The phrase immediately triggered more questions than answers. Victoria felt the cabin slipping beyond her understanding. Earlier, she had been certain she knew exactly who Evelyn was. Now she was not sure of anything. Richard lowered the tablet and looked at Evelyn with unmistakable respect. "In that case," he said, "allow me to be the first person on board to congratulate you." And as those words settled over the silent cabin, every passenger realized the story they thought they understood was only beginning. The silence that followed Richard Lawson's congratulations felt heavier than anything that had happened since boarding began. Several passengers exchanged confused glances. Congratulations for what? Nobody seemed willing to ask the question directly. Yet every person in first class wanted the answer. Victoria Hayes felt the uncertainty more than anyone. Only 30 minutes earlier, she had been completely convinced she understood exactly who Evelyn Brooks was. Now every new detail pushed that certainty further away. Richard remained beside Evelyn's seat, holding the tablet in one hand. The lead flight attendant stood nearby with an expression that combined surprise and respect. Neither reaction made sense to the passengers watching. Evelyn, however, seemed completely comfortable. She accepted the attention with the same calm composure she had shown since entering the cabin. "Thank you," she said quietly. Richard smiled. "You earned it." The businessman across the aisle could not contain himself any longer. "Forgive me," he said politely, "but what exactly are we congratulating her for?" Several heads immediately turned toward Richard. Even Victoria leaned forward slightly. Richard glanced at Evelyn as though seeking permission. Evelyn gave a small nod. "That is fine." Richard looked back toward the passengers. Earlier today, the board finalized a decision that has been under consideration for several months. A hush settled across the cabin. The word board immediately attracted attention. Richard continued. "The update that finally synchronized with our passenger system reflects a new executive designation." Several passengers blinked. Victoria frowned. Executive designation. The phrase sounded important, but not yet clear enough to explain the reactions from the crew. Richard looked toward Evelyn. As of this morning, Ms. Brooks officially joined the Executive Oversight Committee responsible for long-term operations across the entire airline group. Nobody spoke. The businessman stared. A woman seated 2 rows back lowered her phone. Victoria felt her stomach tighten. This was not the answer she had expected. Richard continued. The passenger system had not yet updated her profile before boarding. That was the discrepancy our operations team was resolving. The explanation spread through the cabin like a wave. Suddenly, the unusual attention from the crew made sense. The manifest update, the private conversations, the respect, all of it. Yet there was something even more surprising than Evelyn's new position. It was the way she reacted to it. She did not smile proudly. She did not announce her accomplishments. She simply nodded as though the discussion concerned someone else entirely. The businessman shook his head in disbelief. You never mentioned any of that. Evelyn glanced toward him. Nobody asked. A few passengers laughed softly. The answer was honest and impossible to argue with. Victoria lowered her eyes for a moment. Every assumption she had made since boarding replayed in her mind. The comments, the suspicion, the certainty. None of it felt justified anymore. Richard reviewed the screen one final time and smiled. The updated manifest is now visible throughout the system. The lead attendant looked at Evelyn with renewed respect. Around the cabin, the atmosphere continued changing. Judgment was slowly giving way to curiosity. Curiosity was beginning to transform into admiration. And for the first time since the flight began boarding, Victoria realized the story was no longer about a woman sitting in first class. It was about a woman everyone had completely underestimated. The revelation spread through first class more powerfully than any announcement could have. Passengers who had spent the last half hour quietly judging Evelyn Brooks were now looking at her with entirely different expressions. Some appeared impressed. Others looked embarrassed. A few simply seemed stunned. Yet the person who appeared least affected by the new information was Evelyn herself. She sat exactly as she had before, calm and composed, with her book resting quietly in her lap. Richard Lawson remained nearby for a moment longer before receiving a message on his tablet. After a brief glance at the screen, he smiled. I should return to operations before they start wondering where I disappeared. A few passengers laughed softly. Richard looked toward Evelyn. Congratulations again. Thank you, Richard. The familiarity between them did not go unnoticed. Richard nodded respectfully and stepped away. The lead flight attendant followed him toward the front galley. As soon as they disappeared behind the curtain, the atmosphere shifted again. This time the silence felt different. The mystery was gone. Now people were processing what they had learned. The businessman across the aisle shook his head with a smile. I have to admit, I did not see that coming. Evelyn smiled politely. Most people did not. You could have told everyone much earlier. Another passenger nodded in agreement. Evelyn considered the comment for a moment. Why would I? Nobody immediately answered. The simplicity of the question seemed to catch them off guard. Because people were making assumptions, the businessman replied. Evelyn glanced toward the window before looking back at him. People are free to make assumptions. The cabin grew quiet again. The answer carried no bitterness, no accusation, just a simple observation. Several passengers looked away, perhaps recognizing themselves in those words. Across the aisle, Victoria felt increasingly uncomfortable. Every sentence seemed to highlight the contrast between Evelyn's behavior and her own. She remembered the confidence with which she had questioned the seating assignment, the certainty, the judgment, the quiet attempts to recruit other passengers into her suspicions. None of it looked good now. Yet what troubled her most was not that she had been wrong. It was that Evelyn had never once tried to humiliate her in return. Most people would have seized the opportunity. Evelyn never did. A flight attendant returned carrying departure beverages for the final passengers. This time she approached Evelyn first. The gesture was subtle, but everyone noticed. Can I get anything else for you, Ms. Brooks? She asked. No, thank you. Everything is perfect. The attendant smiled warmly and moved on. Victoria watched the exchange. Earlier, she would have interpreted it as special treatment. Now she understood it differently. It was respect. Respect that had nothing to do with wealth, titles, or authority. Respect that Evelyn had earned through the way she carried herself. The businessman leaned back in his seat. You seem surprisingly comfortable with all of this. Evelyn smiled. You mean the attention? He nodded. Actually, I prefer when people forget I am there. Several passengers laughed. The answer felt genuine. And that was the moment many of them finally understood something important. The reason Evelyn had never mentioned her position was because it was not the most important thing about her. Character was. Humility was. The aircraft door finally closed. The cabin lights dimmed slightly. Outside, airport vehicles moved away from the aircraft. Departure was approaching. Yet before the flight could leave the gate, there was still one person in first class carrying a burden heavier than embarrassment. Victoria Hayes knew she owed Evelyn something she had not yet given. The aircraft slowly pushed back from the gate, and the familiar hum of engines began filling the cabin. Yet inside first class, another kind of tension remained. The mystery had been solved. The assumptions had been exposed. But one conversation still had not happened. Victoria Hayes sat quietly for several minutes, staring at the dark window beside her. The reflections in the glass showed passengers returning to their routines. Some opened laptops. Others resumed conversations. Yet every so often, someone glanced toward Evelyn Brooks with newfound respect. Victoria noticed every one of those glances. Earlier they had been filled with skepticism. Now they carried admiration. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Across the aisle, Evelyn opened her book again. She seemed perfectly content to let the entire incident disappear into the background. That somehow made everything harder. Victoria had spent much of her life around people who demanded recognition. People who used titles, influence, and status as weapons. Evelyn had done the opposite. She never mentioned her position, never corrected anyone, never defended herself. The realization settled heavily on Victoria's conscience. Finally, she closed her laptop and turned toward Evelyn. May I ask you something? The question immediately attracted the attention of the businessman nearby. He lowered his magazine slightly. Evelyn looked up. Of course. Victoria hesitated. For the first time since boarding, she seemed uncertain. When you realized what everyone was thinking about you, why did you not say anything? A hush seemed to settle over the nearby rows. Evelyn considered the question carefully. What would it have changed? Victoria frowned. It would have stopped all of this. Evelyn smiled gently. Perhaps. She glanced briefly around the cabin. Or perhaps people would have simply changed their assumptions. The answer lingered in the air. Several passengers quietly listened. Victoria looked down for a moment. I suppose that is true. The honesty surprised even her. Evelyn closed her book and rested it on her lap. People are usually kind when they know who you are, she said. The real test is how they treat you when they do not. The words landed softly, but their impact was immediate. The businessman slowly nodded. Another passenger looked away, clearly reflecting on the statement. Victoria felt the lesson more deeply than anyone, because she knew exactly how she had treated Evelyn when she believed she was an ordinary traveler. A few moments passed before Victoria spoke again. I owe you an apology. The cabin seemed to grow quiet once more. Evelyn listened without interrupting. Victoria took a breath. I judged you the moment I saw you. I assumed I knew where you belonged. I assumed I knew who you were. Her voice softened. I was wrong. Several passengers exchanged glances. The apology felt genuine. Not performed. Not forced. Just honest. Evelyn studied her for a moment before smiling. Thank you. Victoria looked relieved, but also embarrassed. You are being much kinder about this than I deserve. A faint smile appeared on Evelyn's face. Everyone gets things wrong sometimes. The answer carried no resentment, no desire to embarrass her, only grace. And in that moment, many of the passengers watching realized the most impressive thing about Evelyn Brooks was not her title, her influence, or the updated passenger manifest. It was the quiet dignity with which she treated people, including those who had failed to treat her the same way. The aircraft reached cruising altitude as evening settled beyond the windows. Far below, city lights stretched across the landscape like scattered constellations. Inside first class, the atmosphere felt entirely different from the one that had existed before departure. The tension was gone. The judgment had faded. What remained was something quieter. Reflection. Passengers who had spent the flight observing Evelyn Brooks now viewed her through a completely different lens. Yet what stayed with them was not her title or the updated designation attached to her name. It was the way she had handled everything that came before it. The businessman across the aisle eventually returned to his work, but not before offering Evelyn a sincere smile. Several passengers did the same. Small gestures. Respectful gestures. The kind that required no explanation. Victoria Hay sat quietly for a long time. Earlier she had apologized, and Evelyn had accepted it with grace. Yet the lesson continued unfolding in her mind. She thought about how quickly she had judged someone based on appearance. How easily an assumption had transformed into certainty. Most of all, she thought about how wrong she had been. Near the middle of the flight, Richard Lawson briefly returned to the cabin while checking on operations. As he passed through first class, he stopped beside Evelyn's seat. "How was the flight?" he asked. "Excellent as always," Evelyn replied. Richard smiled. "Good. I was hoping you would say that." A few passengers overheard the exchange and smiled to themselves. The respect between them felt natural now, no longer surprising. Before leaving, Richard added one final comment. "The company is fortunate to have you." Evelyn shook her head slightly. "The company is fortunate to have good people." Richard laughed softly and continued toward the front of the aircraft. The simple exchange seemed to capture everything passengers had learned about her. Even after the reveal, she remained focused on others rather than herself. Hours later, as the aircraft began its descent, cabin lights gradually brightened. Seatbacks were raised. Conversations resumed. The familiar rhythm of travel returned. Yet something about the cabin still felt different. The experience had left an impression. As the city lights grew larger beneath the aircraft, Victoria finally looked toward Evelyn one last time. "Thank you," she said quietly. Evelyn looked up from her book. "For what?" Victoria smiled. "For teaching a lesson you never intended to teach." For a moment, Evelyn seemed genuinely surprised. Then she smiled. "Safe travels, Victoria." The answer was simple, warm, human. The aircraft touched down smoothly a short time later. As passengers gathered their belongings and prepared to leave, nobody rushed toward the aisle. The atmosphere felt unusually calm. One by one, people exited the cabin. Some nodded respectfully toward Evelyn as they passed. Others simply smiled. No announcements were made. No speeches were given. There was no dramatic ending. Only a quiet understanding shared among strangers who had witnessed the same moment. Long after the passenger manifest had updated, the detail most people remembered was not the executive title attached to Evelyn Brooks. It was the dignity she showed before anyone knew who she was. And as the last passengers stepped into the terminal, many carried the same thought with them. Respect should never depend on a name, a title, or a seat assignment. It should be given long before any of those things are revealed.